Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to call the Committee of the Whole for November 6th meeting to order. We acknowledge that the Northern Rockies Administration Center is located in the heart of the traditional territory of the Dene, Cree, and Denesaw people of Fort Nelson and Prophet River First Nations. We further recognize the rights provided by our treaty and celebrate the contributions and enduring presence of the Métis people in our region. This afternoon's meeting will be available to the public to attend virtually and is being streamed and recorded. Are there any additions to the meeting? Seeing none. Are there any anybody online that wants to make public comment? Okay, perfect. So just looking for a motion to accept the agenda. Councillor Roper, seconded by Councillor Souls. All in favor? Passes. Okay, so we're just going to take a short break while we're waiting for the mayor to take his seat.
Okay, how far did you get?
Stop right here, right at reports.
Okay, so we're just back in the committee of the whole meeting essentially. Okay, so okay, good. So if we're back to reports, we'll turn it back over to staff and we'll continue our discussion on this policy. Yeah, I have mine with all my little notes on it. Your knuckles are not white.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah. Okay, so based on my notes, last Friday when council convened to review the feedback that was received throughout the course of our engagement with groups, we left off on page 3 of the administration report. Forgive me, I don't know what the PDF page number is of that, but it's in the section labeled funding levels, reserve, and formula concerns.
Yeah.
Page 4. Is it page 4 of the package? Okay, thank you. And it was just, we'd moved on to the topic of, I'm going to refer to it as scarcity, but it was the thought raised by groups that if the program is opened up to be accessed by more groups, there's a potential that there will be less funds available to all. So in a general sense, that was the message that we heard on a couple of occasions. So open to council to discuss what that might look like in implementation.
Okay, go ahead, Councillor Roper, please.
Yeah, I think we should absolutely get some clarity. It seems like some of us are coming from different places. My intention for developing a policy would be that we aren't pitting the nonprofits against each other for funding and that we're meeting the needs of the community. But I've heard some other messaging, so I'm interested to hear from the rest of the group as to what their intentions were for the policy and the funding, especially with these caps we've been discussing.
So certainly I'll speak up. The intent, I think, of this is to try to create a fair process for all the nonprofits who may or may not have applied or may not even been aware that they could have applied. The fact of the matter is there's only a certain amount of money to go around, and the idea of a policy like this is to try because you have to go through the process of informing all of the nonprofits that are receiving money and aren't receiving money, to try to get a feel for what the demand might look like. And once you start to understand what the demand might look like, then you can determine as a council and as a staff what the pool of money is that's available to try to help that demand. My hope would be is that the pool of money could be big enough that our taxation pool, I guess, is robust enough to support what that looks like. But if it doesn't, there needs to be a process to evaluate, a fair process to evaluate the request from the nonprofits so that you can have a fair process and get the funds that you do have available out in a fair manner. So we don't know, because this is a transition year, what the demand might be. So through this process, I hope, and through at least this year, if not maybe this year and next year, you start to understand what the total demand might be. And then as a council, through the budget process, you determine whether you can afford it or not. Right? That's where we have to get to. And if we can afford it because our tax base is good enough and robust enough, so be it. If it's not, we have a process in place of that we've all agreed upon on how to evaluate the different nonprofits, the services that they provide, and compare those services to each other, apples to apples, as best we can, because we have a structure to do that. And and hopefully not, but we might have to make some hard decisions in the future, but at least there'll be structure to the way those decisions are made. So that's my thought with respect to that. Will there always be enough funding to fund every nonprofit that wants to apply for funds? Nope. There won't be. That's fact. So I don't want to say they're in competition, but sometimes there's going to have to be some hard choices made with respect to what services the council of the day wants to see move forward in the community. So that's my thoughts on those points about scarcity. Anybody else? Councilor Roper.
So we talk about the council of the day. How do we include the community of the day and their wants and needs? Because we talk about the potential of not having enough funding, but that's a political decision by the council. So at what point how do we involve the community to find out specifically what services they want and what the threshold is that they would like to fund? Without leaving it to the discretion of, say, someone that might have a bias against a certain nonprofit or all the nonprofits or something like that. How do we take the community's mind into perspective when making these decisions, when we need to make those hard decisions?
That's why you put structure in place. That's why there's a policy that involves the public while you're trying to create what that structure might look like. That's when the community has an opportunity to say whether or not they agree or disagree, and that's the feedback that we've been getting, and we'll put a structure together. When it comes to future budgets, I would disagree with you that it's completely a political decision. I think the tax base starts to dictate what funds you have available, and the way things have been going and what the future looks not very good. The way things have been going, particularly with the industrial tax base. So we need to have the ability to, councils going forward, need to have the ability to have a structure that they can make those difficult decisions if they have to. When it comes to our own services that we're providing, because remember, these are services provided to the community, not to the municipality, there are two different types of services. When it comes to us deciding what, if we have, there's only two things you can do if you don't have enough money. You cut services or you raise taxes. So call those political decisions if you want, but there's only two options that you have. So before we start cutting services, I certainly would like us to see this community, whether I'm in this chair or somebody else is in this chair, to look at, the services model that we've got, to look at what are the core services that we have to do and what are the core services that are nice to have. When you do a core services review like that, you get the opportunity to determine what are the basic services that this community must be providing, what are the things that we'd like to provide, and do we have enough resources in place to actually carry that out. And at that point, again, there's a whole public process that goes involved with trying to understand from the community what they see the core services that they're prepared to pay for as taxpayers. And then you have another process that helps to guide, you know, if council needs to give direction to staff, that there's services that need to be cut, you at least have some factual information, based on the core services review that involves a public process. And at that point, you use that information as a council to determine what you want to direct staff to do. Are we cutting back on road building? Are we cutting back on recreational services? Where do we need to make those cuts? And if that's not palatable, those cuts are not palatable to the council of the day, then they've got to consider whether they can raise taxes or not, and whether they will raise taxes, and how much, what's affordable. So that's how I see the public being involved is going through a core services review, because you need to have an understanding of what the community is prepared to pay for. And that's where they get involved. So there's a process. And I believe that either we start down that path as a council, or the next council starts down that path. So that we can at least be informed in the event that services need to be reviewed. Councillor Souls.
I think that there's always going to be the need to look at what you're doing in any financial system. In the case of a lower taxation base because of industry shrinkage and so on, we have to look at that every year anyway, regardless of how we look at our budget. So even in the context of trying to establish a policy that gives a percentage of GDP, if you will, a percentage of our tax base, it's still a variable number. And it's always a piece of pie that we have to divide up into enough pieces that people get the pieces of pie. I think that the historical record, like, I don't see that Fort Nelson has changed a whole lot in the last 10 years, except to watch a gradual decline in services and people and so on. And we have fairly clear records of the nonprofit groups that are in the wings, that are there. They've been looking at our grant and aid system over the last few years. And so we have a record of those ones. I can't for the life of me think that there'll be like 50 more of them lining up for this when we've got a fairly broad representation of the service groups in the grant and aid. So I think this question from the public about maybe not having certainty looking forward is a natural one for people to ask, but it's not one that you can give an answer to of absolute certainty on any level. So I think though that then our messaging though, as a result of that, still needs to be one of, we want to support our nonprofits. We hope that we're not seeing 10 applications that have the exact same services that they're offering and so on. We want to support nonprofits, and that's our messaging, and that's real. It's just that the pie scenario will not ever go away in our scenario. I don't see how it can.
So Councillor Roper, you asked the question as to what was how we individually felt about what we hope this policy would bring to light. So I think I'm on the public record for years saying that we need a mechanism for all not-for-profits to apply for funding. And I'm on the record of saying I don't think a 15-minute presentation before council and then you make a decision at the next meeting. I don't think that that was a fair and equitable way for groups to access funding. So at the heart of it, that's what it is for me. You asked the question about like what could be funded and what couldn't be funded. And I think the policy states that it is to align with council's strategic priorities. So at the beginning of each council's terms, they set those strategic priorities. And so that's written into this policy. If it doesn't fit to those strategic priorities, council of the day always has the ability to make a decision outside of any policy. And then I don't know, from my perspective, I thought it was a great idea to have a funding parameter written into the policies so that we had a ballpark figure. But I'm also open if that's problematic and if the community feels that that's setting one not-for-profit against the other, I'm also open to not having it there. And then let the applications come in, see what it is, and the council of the day makes that decision. So, you know, as you point out, that if there is a cap, then maybe that could have some of that sense of competition. But if there's no cap, then there is no competition. And the council of the day makes that decision. And then how do we make that decision? It's the same with anything, Council Roper, right? We all consult with our community, like you ask, how is the community involved? So they're involved through the budget process. We all are working within our communities each and every single day, right? So yeah, that's what I have in answer to your question.
Okay. Anything else? I think we beat that around. I mean, this is a living document. And so that is ultimately the piece that lives on is how is this funded and how much is there? That's and whether there's a structure in place or not, as you point out, that's that's what happens every single year. And council has to make that decision. And, you know, ultimately, if the taxpayer doesn't believe that council has made appropriate decisions, the ultimate time to make changes is at the election. Okay, I think that covered off everything the notes that I had with respect to that particular section. Does anybody else have anything else? I think we can move to the next section. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
So I just wanted some clarification around the comment that the mid-range level of funding is generous. Was that, it's kind of just
Oh,
like,
sorry. Yeah, down there.
yeah,
It was one of the comments. And I don't know,
what level?
yeah, I'm not sure specifically what would be considered not generous. There was no qualifying.
Right,
Yeah.
well, the ones that I did, like I did several of them, and I think all but one of the groups expressed surprise that the $5,000, remember, they could up to $5,000, has been raised to 7,500. So I just wondered if that was one of the comments that.
I'm not sure. It
Okay.
wasn't specific, honestly. That
Okay.
was just the note was that.
And we asked the question a couple of times, you know, is because the $15,000 mark is a bit of a over 15,000 or on between 5,000, 15,000. It was, you
Yeah.
know, is really, it was flexible. We were looking for
Mhm.
feedback on that. And I think
Yeah.
where we asked the question, you know, I think there was a meeting where I was at where that comment was made. 15,000 seems to be a generous amount for that mid-range. And you have to come up with, you know, so if you're having a fairly big function that you need more than $5,000 for, that's 30% up, right? So, you know, they have to come up with 70% on top of that. So, you know, that's a pretty big number if you take 15,000 as 30% of whatever it is that they're doing. So, you know, it would have to be a pretty damn big event for them to go at that level. So that impression I got from when we asked that question. Is 15,000 the right number at the mid-range?
Mhm.
And then I think from staff's perspective, it's now what does the funding agreement look like over that, right? Because there's a big range between 15,000 and I think the max is the library right now at 365 or 360 something. That's a big range. You know, does everybody in that range, should they have the same reporting requirements? I don't think so, right? So really from staff's perspective, that range starts to be a lot of work because you have to work out, you know, because I think we'd like to see at 15,000 reporting requirements quite a bit less than what they'd be at 380,000, right? So there's a lot of work for staff in there. So we could have made it higher, but it didn't make any sense. 30% if let's just say it was 50,000. Well, that's only 30. That's a huge big, but you know, you're almost all the way up to where the big nonprofits are.
Mhm.
So it kind of makes sense.
Pardon me, just in terms of the thought about if there's any concerns, maybe that the fund for this program could get dispersed in the first quarter and have no balance left for the remainder of the year. There was discussions, at least internally, about looking at some disbursement model so that because we're gonna conceivably, the majority of funds will be dispersed in that first part of the year because you're gonna get quite a few applications in the tail end of the year prior. So with the highest end funding applications coming in, if there's any spring projects, spring or summer projects in those lower categories, those are all coming at that end of that year for the coming spring. So you should be able to have a good sense at that point of where your allocation might be. So, and maybe that's not a decision for next year. Maybe that's something taken into consideration for 2026, once we've had kind of a year in practice with this policy, to confirm, you know, what is the demand in the latter part of the year? What might be reasonable to establish as a fall allocation amount within that big budget, just to kind of maybe put some minds at ease that it's not all about dispersing everything right up front and then not leaving that room for someone to come up with a great idea or have a need that emerges mid-year and then not having a avenue to pursue funding. So just some food for thought.
Yeah, and I have some experience with that because NDIT does that. NDIT has been in business for 20 years and that number is shifting all the time, you know, and you know, it tends to be the biggest in that first intake, 70%. And then the other 30% is spread through the rest of the year.
Mhm.
And so that has changed, you know, to where there's been more applications coming later in the year over 20 years. So we had to shrink. The 70 has slowly been shrinking down to 50 and 25 and 25. But that's an evolving thing. And I think until we know the true demand and the times of the year that the demand will come, but I think we can, based on some of the discussion that we've had already, we probably can figure out whether or not there will be, you know, in that second intake of the mid-range. You know, are we gonna get 3 or 4? You know, probably not. We might get a couple though. And so we should be prepared to, you know, just engineer that backwards a little bit. But until we know what the funding, because we're only just still talking, we haven't figured out what the funding model looks like, you know, whether it's based on tax base, whether it's based on services. How are we raising it? And then how much is it? And where, you know, obviously the ones who have always had money will be applying for it, like you say, in that first one. Well, in that first year, is it 70%? What does it look like? We almost have to reverse engineer it that first year. Right? And
I think we don't want to lose sight of it because you said, you know, based on taxes, based on but there's the third option is that it's based on need. So I think it's important that we don't lose sight of that third.
And that's a really good point. We don't really know the need until we have everybody apply. Right, so.
Councilor Roper?
I guess, you know, we should have more of a conversation towards the wording of the grant and like that 30% we were talking about. You know, if you want to apply for $5,000, you're gonna need $16,000 for the rest of your event. And so by that specification, none of these groups that we have listed in the report here, the bigger nonprofits, they're not getting funding from this program because it's supposed to be incremental to their other funding. None of these apply. I wouldn't be able to approve any funding for these groups within the policy as it's written today. So I think we need more discussion and more clarity in what the intentions of that 30% or that.
But that's in the 2 lower levels, right? The lower
That's
level, the
just the
mid
2 lower levels?
Yeah, once you move to the level above 15,000, that criteria no longer, there's no criteria.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay.
And
But it still does say incremental. I mean, it's in the.
Yes, the incremental bit is still there. It's still not intended to be the sole funding. Yeah, but there's no
Okay.
percentage attached to that.
Okay.
so so the 30% was essentially taken from our existing grant and aid policy. The only difference
Mhm.
between that and this is that we can only award up to $1,000 currently in our grant and aid. So the thought was, increase that level or increase that level of funding available, understanding that for some, it might not be achievable to come up with 70%. They're looking for a $5,000 grant. But it provides a bit more flexibility for those who can, where currently $1,000 may not make the difference for some to even use in their project. So the other, I think, just to clarify too, so we
Yeah,
met
I
last
keep making
week.
that mistake.
Yeah.
It's not 30% for both. Yeah.
No, yeah, so we there was a typo in some of our materials, and so the intent was, looked back on our July meeting and in the draft policy. So the intent is that the grant can't account for more than 30% of the project at the lowest level, and then 25% at that mid-level.
Right.
So
Right.
the $5,000 and greater. And then, of course, for projects over $15,000, that's when there's absolutely no formula. It's just acknowledging that it isn't intended to be the sole source. So that kind of, I think will segue. So that was some concerns that were raised on a couple of occasions, was the wording and the language used. So within the policy, we talk about that the government transfers are intended to be supplementary to other revenue sources, not the primary funding source, incremental to other sources of funding. So those speak to me as being additional too, but I think folks are getting very stuck on the fact that though they may have another source of revenue, it's not significant. It could be considered not significant enough to they don't want to be ineligible because the only other sources of revenue they have are far less than what they're asking for. So I don't know how we might be able to bring some clarity to the language, to Councillor Roper's point about, I think there's this fear that that language might be used to exclude some applicants based on their current funding models.
Right. And just to expand on that concern, because we probably were talking to the same group of people, they weren't necessarily worried about this council, but it's for future councils, right? It's because, like, how many councils down the road, you're reading a policy, and we have all been like deeply immersed in this policy, and we have, been making these presentations out into the community, and so we're hearing what people are saying. And so, yes, thanks for that reminder, Jay. There was that fear of how can we, I don't know, tighten up the wording. I don't know if that's the right adjective to describe it, but there's the concern that when there's somebody reading the black and white of a policy, that just make sure that that policy is not, like, it doesn't have unintended consequences.
The intent for me of that is to make sure that the nonprofits are doing what they can, right? To generate some income from themselves, some source revenue. I don't know if you can change those words. There's only so many words that you can use to express that intent, but what you could do perhaps is explain it a little bit better in the guide.
Yeah.
Right? Explain the intent in the guide. That the intent here is really not to limit nonprofits because they're not doing fundraising or self-revenue. The intent is to, or that the limit is not high enough. The intent is that they're doing it, and that they're not solely relying on the municipality to provide, all their operational funds, because we're one of the only ones that are going to be allowing operational funds to be used out of this. I mean, that tends to be unheard of, right? Because the funding agencies can't control where the money is being spent or how it's being spent at the operational level. But when it's for a project, that's why it's easy to go with capital, because it's for a thing. The thing gets bought or it doesn't get bought. When it's operational, it's much more loosey-goosey and hard to try to pin it down. And so I think what I hope this would try to do is just get this clause, is to just get the point across that the nonprofit should be trying to generate income wherever they can, their own sources of revenue. And yeah, and you determine, and future, I mean, we can't bind the hands of future councils. All we can do is try to clarify the best we can what our intent was. And turn it out there. Those councils are gonna make those decisions if there's not enough to go around. And I say that, that's the if. If there's enough to go around, it's never a problem. It's if and when there's not enough to go around. Yeah.
So a part of that is I like the idea of the intent, and let's expand our description or guide, however that may be. But also knowing full well, we have these groups that we've been funding the majority of. We could have in the description that this is our intent, but we do acknowledge we will accept funding programs like we have in the past for A, B, and C. And then that might give those groups some reassurance. Like, yeah, this is the intent. We don't want it to be sole, but we do accept funding programs like we have in the past for Group A, Group B, Group C. And we can make a list of them, and then we can give those people a little assurance. We will look at it, but this is the intent behind it. We have made agreements in the past, but this is the intent. Because otherwise we're potentially losing groups if that whole intent gets lost in 5-6 years.
Unless I'm mistaken, I don't think that we have a group that doesn't have a source of funding outside the NRM.
Right.
And sorry,
Yeah.
I don't know at this point in time whether I would be willing to fund something like virtually 100%. You know what I mean? Like, I think all of our not-for-profits that we're currently supporting. I mean, I don't know about the grant needs because I don't look at them as closely, but of the grants that we have been funding, I believe everybody has other sources of revenue in there. And so when I was reading the policy and then looking how it could possibly affect some of our legacy groups, for lack of a better word, I felt that they all fit into the way I was reading the policy as it was written. So.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and I wasn't thinking we'd 100% fund one. Councils at the time could decide for sure, right? It was just more of, because it was those legacy groups that had come back with this concern. So like, well, let's just write it in there. Like, we have agreements that are acceptable, like these legacy groups, where we're the majority funder, but not the sole funder. And that's okay too. We will accept agreements this way, but here's some of the parameters we've set for these groups. So you might have similar parameters if you want an option like this. It just, because we got to be a little bit flexible at that side where people are getting concerned.
Since in one respect, the Northern Rockies is a backstop for all the legacy groups that have options for income from elsewhere. They're, in a sense, we're a backstop. And I think that the necessity, it may be wise to put within our guidelines that the groups apply for funding from other sources and make that a requirement of it, because the idea of there's, if you look at the legacy groups, there are funding streams that exist. Are we asking for them? Because it's not as though everyone's in a business with a nonprofit to just make money overall, and that's their whole goal. They're trying to provide a service, and I get that very much. But the idea of other layers of government that also have, like when you have, I'll just use what I heard at UBCM, when you have a whole network of libraries across the province that are asking for a better funding model through the province to actually create a more clear policy for the province of how they do the funding. I think that that is something that is not within our wheelhouse at all. And yet it's something that we would expect the libraries of our community, a library of our community, to be looking at too and being part of.
And I think that the application clearly asks if other funding has been applied for and what that looked like. And I think the way the policy is written by it, like it says that it's, you know, you need to have supplemental funding. I think at least my perspective on it, was the vaguer the better, to allow more not-for-profits as much room as they needed. Once you get too prescriptive, then you get not-for-profits that don't fill in. So the way I read it, that vagueness allowed for more eligibility.
Well, go ahead.
Yeah, I like the wording supplemental income. Maybe we should consider taking out that the municipality's funding is meant to be incremental to other sources of funding, because that's the wording I believe in the policy. So to me, that's pretty clear that you have to be raising more money elsewhere than we're going to give you. And a lot of these groups, it's not fitting in their funding models. So I absolutely agree. And there's very little funding out there for operation, if none. And if you look on paper, the Phoenix Theater this year raised $140,000 for projects. Not a dime of that goes towards the operation. That's for capital improvements, which are great, which are amazing, but it doesn't help the operation. So, you know, on paper, it looks like the theater raised a bunch of money, but it's deceiving because it doesn't help the operation. It just goes into a project, and that's what's being funded. So, yeah.
In that same section, there was I needed clarification, or I wanted to ask a question. So it's mid-page, and it says acknowledgement that some not-for-profits will be applying to the NRM as last chance funding, with a need to be able to identify those situations differently from those who rely on NRM funding. So the last chance funding bit threw me aside with respect to the fact that we wanted these nonprofits to be self-sustaining, right? That we didn't want to just give somebody a bunch of money if they weren't going to be around next year. We wanted to be able to assess that these nonprofits were sustainable. And so I'm really not understanding what that comment is about, or is it, are there groups out there who think that we will do last chance funding?
I think it was just about where some groups have experienced, like they have been self-sustainable, but something has occurred. So maybe they've lost some core funding that they've relied on for many years. And so they've never yet approached municipalities. So this would be like their attempt to basically recover or continue to sustain in a different way. So
Right.
I think of some examples we've already seen where groups have come to the table and you know, they've experienced a major setback of many different ways, and they've asked for seed funding for something, like Lamplighters being a great one. They felt that in order to be sustainable, they needed a dedicated staff person. We granted them funds, a one-time grant, and that was 3 years ago or 4 years ago. So in that case, we were their last chance, and it helped them to be successful.
Right. So, but it doesn't necessarily have to be last chance, right? It could be that it's to be sustainable, we need this bump. We
Right.
need this seed funding.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I see that differently than,
Yeah.
okay.
And there is that opportunity. They could get up to $15,000, which is a nice seed, right? So 2 times a year you can apply for that. So, you know, I think that there is that option too. And I don't think that a policy is ever going to sort of outline absolutely every scenario, right? I mean, your policy would be so huge that it would be unmanageable. And there is always the option to address council outside of any policy, outside of any bylaw, like.
I do just want to clarify the point that you made, though, that you have two times a year. It's 2 intakes, but only 1 award, right? So.
Yes, 2 times a year you could apply,
Apply.
but you're only awarded once,
Right.
correct? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And I'd just like to further on that, I would trying to think of like a time when that would happen. And this is most likely going to be a well-established group already that they've done their due diligence in my mind. And if they're coming to the municipality for last chance funding, it's because they've exhausted all other funding sources. And that's kind of what we want to see happen anyways. Come to us when you need it, and then we can assess it then. Right? Like I don't see that as as a negative either. Like, we want these groups to come to us, and if anything, that's the group that's already, exhausted all other options, and that's really what this program's for.
Yeah, if I could just apply. So there's 4 times a year you can apply for up to $5,000. And then 2 times a year you can apply for up to $15,000. And then once a year for anything over. So I think that provides a lot of opportunities. Yeah.
And I would hope the emergency funding wouldn't be necessary. You're right. Anybody can come to council with an idea at any time, but you hope a policy like this gets those people involved enough that they don't need to come for that one-time emergency, whatever it is. You hope it eliminates it. Probably doesn't eliminate it, but certainly you hope to see that it minimized. So, okay. Does anybody have any comments with respect to the reserve funding comment that's there? So I need to ensure that terminology for reserve funding is clear in how it applies to the applicant group and how it applies to the NRM's establishment of reserves for unawarded. So I wasn't sure whether this was reserves that the nonprofits are setting up, or this is the reserve because there's money left over that we put into the bigger reserve that would help to bridge this policy over maybe a bad year.
I think it's both. So
It's both?
yeah, so
Yeah.
I think the concern was just that there was some clarity needed in what we were talking about in which instance. So, yeah.
Because we have had discussions in the group as we moved forward that reserves set up by the nonprofits needed to follow the basic rules that we have with respect to reserves that we keep. Right? It has to be set
They
for a
have to have a
certain
policy.
function, there has to be details around how much and the total amount, that sort of thing, so that reserves don't get so big that there's money that's not being used. Councilor Roper.
Yeah, and I wanted to touch base on just some of the wording in the draft policy about unspent funds and what happens to those. So it states that they're supposed to be given back. But we actually have a policy here, reserves and surplus policy 5918. And it has well-established reserve policies for the nonprofits. There's a cultural one, there's a library one. And it clearly states any unused funds from your operation will be placed into a reserve fund. And so now we're saying any unused funds are to be given back. So I think we need to clarify that, address this bylaw, and just make sure that we have everything kind of clear.
Yeah, I agree that there's some clarity that's needed on that as to how much. I mean, that's money that wasn't used. It was given for a particular purpose and it wasn't used for some reason. It's no different than us. That means if we got money left over at the end of the year, it didn't get used for something that was in our budget. So either A, we didn't do what we said we were going to do, or B, we requisitioned too much money from the public. Right? And that's not our money. And so the same basic principle should apply to the nonprofits. They asked for the money, they either used it for what they asked it for, or they found some efficiencies, in which case we've allowed for them to set up some bits of reserve, but those reserves still need to be looked at overall with respect to, you can't just have them and hold them for perpetuity. There's got to be a reason for them and how they're going to be used. And so I think we need clarity around that. I certainly would like to see clarity around that, because when you look at their books and you see these reserve funds, well, I don't know what they're being used for. It's money that was collected from the taxpayer and given to them and not used for what they said they were going to use it for, or they found efficiencies, and that's great if they did. And so I believe it's good monetary policy to understand how those reserves are set up, what they're set up for, and what the maximums are.
I think the IDCA agreement that we have actually is a good case to follow, is how this works. And see, we often end up with excess money that's part of a plan where we're aiming for a particular thing, and then it's approved over the course of each year as we interact with our counterpart in government. And it's not as though that money has to be given back in those circumstances. It's actually in reserve for part of an agreed upon project going forward. So that's just a caveat to giving it back.
So I'm not sure if clarification of that needs to be in the policy or whether it needs to be in the guideline. But either way, we should wrap some words around that. Councilor Roper?
Yeah, and I think just to get a full view of these operations and for full transparency, we should be getting capital plans. And some operations are more capital heavy than others, but every piece of equipment they have in their building has a life expectancy and it has a replacement date. And so we used to fund reserves for some of the nonprofits, and we stopped doing that a few years ago when the tax base was starting to decline. But I think when we get their applications, when we get their reporting, they need to justify if those reserve funds are either going to go into an account for a specific reason, or if they get given back to the municipality. If they have no need for reserve funds and they're just saving for a rainy day, well, then that's one scenario. But if they actually have a need, let's say they have $500,000 worth of capital items to fund over the next 10 years, well, then they might need more to continue those operations. So
Agreed. And that's where the funding agreement between the two parties will set that out. You know, because we recognize we discuss what their budget or their capital needs would be over time. It's no different than the way we look at, you know, assessing our buildings and our asset management.
And at the point of application, we are asking for some pretty detailed information on capital requests so that there's a full understanding about what they may have in reserve and where those revenues might be coming from, other grants or revenue, their own reserve contributions, borrowing, whatever, so that we can make an informed decision.
So just to muddy the water even further around the capital piece, and I'm hoping that there's going to be something in there around ownership of. So if the municipality is funding something capital, in its entirety, then who does that belong to? That piece of equipment or car or building or whatever it happens to be. If we're going to fund the capital, then does that, the not-for-profit retains ownership of that and then can sell at will. So I think we need to make sure that we have something in there.
Yeah, and particularly, well, that's one of the things that came up at Search and Rescue, right? Their agreement, here's I could understand from the discussion we had the other day, was their agreement with the province is that anything that they've got in the Search and Rescue pool of capital, if they were to go defunct, that equipment gets spread to other.
Which,
but we
pay for it.
Right, and so that's what I'm saying. So I think we need to clarify that because all of a sudden the equipment that we've purchased over the years might get distributed across the search and rescue networks around the province. So we need clarity about whether that's just capital at the province or is it everything that comes into the search and rescue society, right? So that is one of those clarifications that we need around capital. So I agree. What happens to it when the entity ends?
And I struggle with that one back and forth a little bit because we're funding, we're giving this money to an organization to do with what we've agreed upon. But then it's theirs. It's no longer ours. We handed that money over. It's not the municipalities. That's a donation in my mind. And you want to take it back. I do have difficulties with it though, because I see the logic behind using public money for funds like that. So where I would like to see some sort of agreement is if you disband, that stuff gets pulled back into this grant to community groups on however, which group needs it. Maybe we auction it off and that might fund our next few years. Because then at least that way we're keeping it for its purpose, the grants services to groups.
And I think that's the intent is that
Yeah.
it's not ever to take it away from them if they're still in operation. It's when they cease operations for whatever reason.
Yeah.
They retire the asset.
Yeah.
And I would just like to see that asset retirement or just the retirement of a group, those funds get replenished back into the non-for-profit grant to groups program we're making.
Go ahead.
So that might get a little complicated. Let's say, I mean, we're not 100% funding any capital right now, I don't think. So let's say we contributed capital funding to a project where it was incremental to the other sources. And then something happens to that nonprofit, and then you've got this asset. Well, we only own a percentage of that technically. So are we cutting it in half? And but the other part is, you know, when a capital grant is received, there's no expectation from the grant organization that those funds would ever be given back in the form of an asset or otherwise. I mean, if I purchase a new concession, that concession, you know, if the theater closed tomorrow, and I don't think NDIT wants the carpets ripped up and the concession sent back. They've given the funding, and that's it. So, yeah, I think some clarity so that we don't have assets that might be pilfered from the community. I mean, we saw Northern Health take some very expensive things from here that we fundraise locally, and I don't think we want that. But I don't think we want old things coming back to us years later that has no purpose or function or. Yeah, no, for sure. But it's something to ponder.
It's got to go in the agreement and it becomes part of the funding agreement between that staff will negotiate with the. Okay. Is that the end of that? I think that's all the comments in that funding levels, reserve and formula concerns. Next is the least fair market value and GST risk is.
This kind of least fair market value and GST risk isn't that the policy we're in looking
That's
at, right? Yeah. Yeah. We're working on that through a different policy.
So the next kind of area of feedback was around the capacity of some of the groups in the community when it comes to applying and reporting. And then also concerns about the cost of meeting insurance requirements and potentially meeting the financial auditing or review requirements. So I think council addressed that at the last meeting, that depending on the value of the grant, there could be some flexibility around what that type of financial report might look like. So we might have groups that while they're only accessing a small amount from us, they already do audited financial statements. We have others that might be accessing a level of funding that we feel the need for having a professionally reviewed set of financial reports. So I think if council's comfortable leaving that up to staff to come back with some options that might be acceptable, and then kind of think about how we might apply them on a case-to-case basis.
I think the policy can stay fairly general with respect to it. I think the guidelines probably should be more detailed around what the options might be at, you know, what the expectations for a third party review at whatever level that third party review, because there's multiple levels there. You know, at what funding level that looks like, and what portion of that potentially that the municipality is prepared to pay for, right? Because it's it does start to get expensive once you start getting up to, you know, into the audit stage. But, you know, we can't not consider doing audits where we're giving out hundreds of thousands of dollars. That has to be in the arsenal of review, because it's just the right thing to do when you're spending the taxpayers' money. My thoughts there, but doesn't mean it has to be written into every single agreement. But it's got to be available to us in the policy. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, so many things we've already heard. So just even today talked about a lack of availability of grants towards operations. How we could, I think we might have discussed this at the last meeting, how the NRM could support some of the organizations with some of our in-house capacity, potentially by sharing templates, knowledge on how to build budgets, governance training, and things like that. And then at one meeting, the community foundation concept was discussed. So it's that model that City of Fort St. John has adopted in recent years, where they basically flow the funds that they had been granting to their local groups in past years to a foundation to manage on their behalf. So essentially they have a not-for-profit group with a board made up of a wide range of members that are doing the administration of the grants. So I think the North Peace Community Foundation doesn't just manage the City of Fort St. John's bequest, but they manage a number of different programs, one of which is the City of Fort St. John's programs. So that was a thought on that. And there were some earlier comments in the report about concerns about conflict of interest, given our size, our community size. So just matching that comment with that. In terms of collaboration and duplication, so there were some questions asked during our meetings around how the NRM might be able to foster collaboration among groups, and with one of the goals of the policy to reduce duplication among applications and among organizations. So one of the great ideas that was raised was that we host a leaders table or a community of practice. So it was acknowledged that there is the community roundtable meeting, which is great, and it's well attended, I think, and people take a lot from it, though it's a bit of a different purpose, I think, than having, let's say, executive directors and managers from a lot of the not-for-profits coming together to talk about, you know, opportunities for collaboration or future-looking projects and partnerships and things like that. So that was kind of a cool idea. There was the comment about having some agencies deliver a fuller service within their scope to reduce the burden on others and fill the gaps. So I think where there's been an observation that some communities or some groups where they may be currently lacking capacity and have to reduce services, another organization potentially with a not as identical mandate picks up the slack, and then kind of returning that equilibrium never happens. So then you have some organizations who aren't fulfilling their mandate, maybe want to begin to do that, but now it's been taken over by another group. So I think fostering collaboration could help align some of that potentially. There was a desire to have an opportunity to communicate more with council, either through routine reports to council, or having some measure of two-way feedback. So I think there was an acknowledgement that council liaisons do attend their assigned board meetings routinely, but I think it was a desire to have kind of a two-way dialogue with council at the table level. We had some groups talking about opportunities they've been leveraging to subcontract some of their services and programs. So while they might not have the capacity to deliver the service themselves, they are skilled at grant writing. And so they'll do the application and they'll look after the overhead, but they subcontract the service to another organization. So it's kind of a win-win in that sense, that it's providing a breadth of programs among groups that already exist without having to try to hire new or compete for funding. And then also just, I think there was an appreciation that the grant writer position or that go-to source of information at the NRM would continue and be able to foster collaboration among all the not-for-profits in the community. So there was some there were sentiments expressed about the appreciation for that position and the role that they played in the community.
I don't think there's anything in that section that we need to change any of the wording of I think those are all good ideas and opportunities for us moving forward, but there's no reason to change the policy.
No, absolutely not.
Good.
I think those would all come out throughout the implementation.
Yeah.
So financial uncertainty for the NRM and for not-for-profits was a fairly significant topic. So there was a lot of discussion about the risks of reductions in our tax base. You know, the recent write-off for uncollectible taxes suggests potential for decline, and then as well as growing expenses to account for in future years. None of that is news to council. There was a comment at the Community Connect session, just that businesses are in survival mode. So where there was maybe in past a willingness or an ability to support with direct donations and things like that to not-for-profits, that that ability is no longer there for that fundraising or corporate partnership opportunities. And an acknowledgement that there has been a need or a demand on a lot of our core municipal services. That has increased in recent years. So it's just that idea of affordability for all programs and services to the tax base. Some of the not-for-profits express concerns that their revenues might be seasonal and unpredictable, and it might limit their ability to predict their program stability and their cash flow and their planning accordingly. And depending on when that season occurs, in line with the application deadlines, just yeah, that might have an impact. There were some concerns about any financial obligations that some of the not-for-profits might have recently incurred. So this in particular was in relation to the museum and the investment that they made recently in expanding the museum facility. And just that they may have given those decisions a second thought if they thought that there might be a threat to the security of annual funding.
I think that just highlights the differences between two councils.
Mhm.
Like the last council they supported extra funding for capital for the museum at the time. And I don't see that happening at this council, right? So that's just another one of those things.
Yeah. There was an acknowledgement that if some of the not-for-profits were to receive a funding level less than what they have in past years, that may require a reduction in services. And it may be to a point of unsustainability for that organization. There were concerns about the discretionary nature of the program, given some of the not-for-profits in the community have had long-standing funding relationships with the NRRM. I think that just goes to the concern that it's what may have been perceived as a guarantee in past years is trying to be standardized moving forward. Concerns were raised about the agreements and Councillor Roper, you brought this up as well, where a recipient group holding a surplus at the end of the year is potentially prevented from contributing them to reserves, instead having to return them to the NRRM. And then the language built into the policy around giving council the opportunity or the discretion to not award funds despite meeting eligibility creates uncertainty. And then there was just comments around the fact that some of the not-for-profits that experienced a hold at 2024 funding levels have an expectation that the years to come will be years of recovery financially, potentially, and there may be requirements for higher levels of funding. And that was it for feedback. So I'm not sure if council has any thoughts or comments on some of those.
I don't have any. One final, what's this one say? Yeah, no, we answered that when we talked about the clarification around the reserves, so that one's good. Yeah, that's the end of anything that I had on there. So it's 1:20. We got it done in an hour, even though it started a little late. So, yeah, I think the feedback from the community was good. I don't think it all applies to necessarily, requirements to change, the draft the draft policy. There are some things where we're looking for some clarification. I think we identified what those are, so. Are there any last comments, I guess, from anybody before we adjourn and turn it over to staff to really try to make the final changes to, I guess, a couple things, the draft policy itself and where we're looking for clarifications, whether you believe it should go into draft policy or whether we can handle it in guidelines, right? So, and then those will get presented to us at another day. Counselor Andrews, I see your lights on.
Yeah, just a comment to reading through all these questions and concerns and comments we had from the community. It was reminiscent of the questions and comments, concerns our council had around the table as well. Like lots of these points or considerations that we've been thinking through. So it's nice to see that we're not completely off topic for what the community wants. Like there's a few things we definitely got to fix a bit, but I think we, as far as our first go at it, we did a pretty good job at hitting, at least the target.
Well, we worked on it for 6 months, right? And a lot of these things that we're discussing now were talked about at length in those sessions that we had. And so, yeah, if you're coming from it from the right place, one of an open-minded place, then you really have got a fulsome draft policy in the end. So I agree with you. I think we did a pretty good job. It is a living document. There's a transition phase that we have to go through. There's no doubt about it. And one of the things that's jumping out of my mind and has been there for a while is that long-term, potential planning for something that needs to come forward where there needs to be multiple years. Well, that once this gets up and running, we or the next council, whoever, can start looking at the opportunity for multi-year funding agreements because of a particular project that somebody wants. I mean, so that it's a living document that can be looked at. But I think for now, we need to get through this transition and really see what the demand will be and how we can address that demand. Did I see your hand up? Oh, no. Okay.
Yeah, I just want to thank staff for all the work that they put in and all of the extra hours where they attended so many sessions. And just, I wanted to express my gratitude to all of the not-for-profits, the board, the staff that took the time out of their very busy days to meet with us and go through all of these sessions. They were just so valuable, and I believe it will contribute to the most robust policy, bylaw, whatever we're gonna call it. Yeah, so thanks very much.
Anybody else? Seeing none, then this committee, the whole meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much.